When we talk through our process and our framework with people, we talk about it in that format. It's the customer experience, the employee experience, and then the owner experience or the business case. And those three things have to remain in balance. Everyone wants to talk about the customer experience. We want to do customer journey mapping, and we want to talk all about the customer experience. But when you're in a high-touch service business, the employee experience is every bit as important as the customer experience.
Welcome to the Intangible brand, where we explore the connection between employee experience and client experience and the hidden forces that make brands stick. I'm Jerry Gennaria, and I'm joined by my co-host, Carl Winstead. And today we're talking to Tate Fisher. He's the founder of Katalyst Group. Tate launched Katalyst to help companies scale customer experience in ways that are consistent but never generic. His background in retail and franchising, and now in designing methodologies for repeatable but human-centered service, gives him a unique lens on what makes experiences scalable without losing their soul. Tate, thanks for being here.
Welcome. How's it going?
Good. Great. Yeah, Tate, welcome. Glad to have you joining us. It might be great as a kind of a starting point to give our listeners a little bit of context. So take the stage and tell us about yourself.
Oh, wow. Well, about me. So, started my first company at 16 years old. So, have been an entrepreneur, and I would say blessed and highly favored. Was born into farming, ranching, and entrepreneurship family.
Mhm.
So it was, the joke is it was in my genes, and they were Wranglers. So that's how I got my start, which was a huge blessing. So I had a lot of encouragement from my family, and so it was no surprise to anybody that I fell in love with business ownership and entrepreneurship. I oddly enough was headed towards art school, and because that's what I always loved, and I explained to people a long time ago. And so as a teenager, I started building brands and building companies, and that was the thing I explained to people. I was like, building businesses is the most mixed media form of art that I've ever discovered. And so that's kind of how I approached it. In my early 20s, was in the right place at the right time, and was able to take part in the wonderful wave that was wireless and telecom during that time. And so had some early success in building out some brands in the wireless and telecom space. And then ultimately that's what turned into Katalyst years later. So, but other than that, love the Midwest, based out of Kansas City. Grew up on the edge of Colorado, and I love it because it's in the center and we get to go everywhere. Right,
Yeah.
It's a wonderful place to call home base because we get to travel all over and see a lot of the world and a lot of the country. And but always loved coming back to the Midwest, come back to Kansas City, and raising a family here. My wife grew up on a farm too. So a couple of farm kids that moved to the city, and we love it. So
Sounds like a great sitcom.
So you mentioned that the jeans were Wrangler. What about the boots? What were the boots?
Oh,
What's that? That's a great question. My wife could answer that question much better than I could. The irony behind that is growing up in that world. My granddad's in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. My dad was a professional team roper for a lot of my childhood, and oddly enough, my wife is an AQHA horse show judge. And so that whole world, and I barely know how to ride a horse. Because I ran as far away as I possibly could from that world, and got into telecom and tech, because I saw how hard they all worked to make it's a hard living.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we're big fans of Tecovas, and so shameless plug to anyone who knows somebody at Tecovas. We'd love to have you on the show. But Kansas City is a wonderful city. I like to think of it as the most eastern western city or the most western eastern city. It has this beautiful mix of both. So telecom.
We did some market research in Kansas City here a while back, and it was amazing how many of the different factors around like demographics and a lot of those kind of things, right? Like
Yep.
Kansas City is actually in like a lot of different ways, like a perfect, um, like a microcosm of the U.S. as a whole,
Hmm.
which was really fascinating and interesting to see that the way Kansas City works, we're a pretty good representation of a much larger swath of America, which is always fascinating. So there's a lot of beta tests that get done here, a lot of market research that gets done here. So to your point, it's that exact thing because it's kind of like, well, they're a little bit of everything,
Right.
and I think that's one of the things that makes Kansas City really great, and it feels like home to everybody that comes here.
Yeah.
So
They can
Interesting.
find themselves there.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
you talked about telecom, and I know from some of our past conversations, working on some of that telecom work and the experiences that consumers have interacting with those brands has been a big part of your work over the years. But help us make the jump from where you were in telecom to starting Katalyst. Was there a particular problem that you were trying to solve that no one else was addressing, or
Yeah.
how did you make that leap?
The simplest version of that, and how I can explain it today is, the construction industry is just fundamentally not designed to help multi-location service brands scale and build, right? Like that's
Mhm.
just not
Yeah.
how the construction industry at large
Very
is
regional.
it,
Right.
right. Well, and it's designed fundamentally to build unique snowflakes, right? We're going to build every project is this custom, unique snowflake of a project, and we're only going to ever do it once.
Yeah.
And so, and let's call, and the architects have been chasing the dream of modular productized, construction for a really, really long time. Um, and the cool part is we've accomplished some of that today. And in the commercial space, I still
Mhm.
don't think anybody has quite figured it out in residential, but
Yeah.
so that's kind of where that comes down to is we were looking for solutions to be able to get through that part of the process to scale the business, and scale it effectively, actually scale the parts that mattered. And to your point, no, I couldn't find the solutions to that problem. So in fairness, I've spent the last 2 decades just continuing to peel back the layers of the onion to really fully understand just how complex and challenging of a problem it is.
Right.
Yeah.
But so there's a reason why it's there's not a lot of people out there solving that specific problem. Um, and it and the solutions that we put together don't really apply to a lot of the other
Mhm.
situations, right? Like our frameworks and the way that we go about things and the way that we think about things would be a horrible solution for building a hospital.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right? Like that's
Yeah.
like because we're not going to build a bunch of the same hospital over and over and some of that kind of stuff. And so it's about designing the right solutions and the right frameworks and the right methodologies for that specific problem. The good news is there's hundreds of multi-location service brands that are growing at any given time. So it's a big problem.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just a big problem that's chopped up into a bunch of tiny little projects, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned the idea about, you think that you'll find some way to replicate the thing. And, one of the things that we do at Klein, we do a lot of we do multifamily work.
yeah,
And you would think, "Oh, well, it's just," at some point, you're just plugging in unit plans. But, it is no matter how that sounds like you could replicate that, like, you're right. Everything is always different. Every site's different. Every jurisdiction's different. And so while you may have the framework for repeating things, it's never a true just, yeah, plug and play. We found that true as well too. We've chased that as, on the idea too. It doesn't exist.
yeah, it's very, very challenging. And you said it correctly. It's funny because everyone thinks that the work to do is to replicate the things, but the actual work to do is to replicate the processes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right? So it's replicating how you go about accomplishing the things that is actually what creates the success. And yes, as much of the things that you can replicate and make the same, that is obviously, there's efficiency gains in that and whatnot. but that's actually not the thing that creates the outcome, right?
Yeah.
So and we can talk more about that, but
Yeah.
I forgot what the question was.
I think we navigated it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thinking about founding a company, that it always involves risk, and conviction,
Yeah.
and just curious, what do you believe about the customer experience, the client experience, or about the future of retail and franchising that pushed you to build your own way, around things and doing it in your own methods?
That's a great question, and hopefully I have a fantastic answer for that. And it's never what people necessarily expect. I mentioned that I was a young entrepreneur and have really enjoyed that and came from that family and fell in love with entrepreneurship. Um, but people sometimes get confused about why that is, right? But my experience has kind of taught me that communities that are full of thriving small business owners they're fundamentally better societies and better communities. And, again, I grew up in rural Kansas, so I got to see it firsthand, these little communities that, when the thriving small business owners left, they just dried up
Mm.
and blew away, right? We saw that happen, you can literally watch it happen in real time in these little communities. Um, and it looks different when we get into the major metro areas, but the same thing is happening. And then when you zoom out even further and look at it on the most macro level, you go, man, what does our society look like if we don't have thriving small business owners
Mm.
creating opportunity, creating innovation, lifting up all of those people around them? My take on the world is that the small business community is the most philanthropic group of people that have ever existed. They are helping all the people around them in a million different ways, the ripple effects of what they
Mhm.
do. I've been doing this for 2 decades now, and the number of stories we have about small business owners helping their communities. I mean, it's everything from the basic stuff like sponsoring the little league team,
Yeah.
to taking that single mother who's working for you and putting tires on her car in the middle of the shift.
Mhm.
And it's giving giving folks an opportunity to better themselves and train themselves, so that they can move on and do something additional with their life that they wouldn't have had that other opportunity for. And we've had thousands of those stories. And the core component to all those stories is you've got these successful small business owners because they get tied into their communities. They're
Mhm.
involved in the lives of their employees, right? They are doing things that matter. And when we don't have that, like society is what suffers at large. And so that was something that I recognized early on and just developed a huge passion for early on.
Mhm.
Um, you know, our and we put our money where our mouth was in the early days of Katalyst, and we can get into the story and the history, but there was a time period where I made a decision. It was 2016, and I drew a line in the sand and I said, we're here to use our powers for good, right? So not to support evil corp,
Mhm.
as we call it, right? And so we made the decision at that time that we weren't really that interested in supporting and helping publicly traded companies.
Mm.
Um, and uh, and that's where franchising, just I fell in love with the franchising community and the people in the franchising space. Practically it's the best of both worlds, right?
Right.
We get these big brands that have economics of scale and problems to
Yeah.
solve that we can make real, like we can really move the needle on. But then when it comes right down to it, you're moving the needle for all these individual small business owners.
Right.
And so
Right.
that's what drew me to franchising, and that's what we found. And today I'm a massive franchise advocate, and I love the space. And I love so many of the people that are involved in it. It's just an awesome community. But the reality is my mission is not about franchising. My mission's about how do we create as many successful small business owners as we can.
Mhm.
There's nothing I want to see a bunch of folks change their family legacies and create that first generation wealth, in all the ways that matter, right? And money is a pretty important piece of that equation for most folks.
Right.
And because it gives them the freedom to do a lot of the other things that are really important to them, right? So, so when you talk about the conviction of why we do what we do, like that's why I do what I do. I do what I do every day because we get to help lots of small business owners do really cool stuff and make huge impact in their communities. Um, and that keeps me pretty motivated because if it wasn't for that, nobody would do what I do. Like nobody would do what we do because it is difficult, it is hard,
Mhm.
it is frustrating,
Yeah.
and there's probably way easier ways to make money. My gosh. Uh,
Yeah.
Well,
so there you go.
so
Yeah.
so you've created a service firm, but what you've really created is a framework for helping clients scale. And I'm hoping that maybe you can talk a little bit about that framework and the challenge that you're actually solving. You mentioned franchises. Are you working directly for the franchisees, or are you working for sort of the franchisor? Help us understand just a little bit how you're plugging into the problem that you're solving, in this methodology that you've created.
That's a great question. It's the right question. Um, and again, because I like hard things and I like to find the most complicated problem I can, the answer to your question is yes, right? So we're working with both the franchisor and the franchisee.
That makes sense.
So we work with the franchisor and we have a framework and a methodology that we help them go through to put all the tools and processes and stuff in place, that then get used to empower the franchisees to get their locations open and operational and through the construction process, and set them up for success. So that's the two-part effect of what we're doing. So we are working with both of them, in different parts of the work that we do. Um, it starts with the franchisor,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if we're going to replicate success at scale, then we have to ensure that we are creating success
Mm-hmm.
to begin with. And so that brings me to the answer to your question is what are the real problems we solve? And there's really two primary buckets that those problems fall into. And the one that we always talk about and the one that always is interesting to everybody is, well, how do we get locations open faster, cheaper, easier, right? How do we make the construction process easier and faster? Because the faster we get open, it's oftentimes an interesting conversation when we get into the conversations around cost and speed. Now, obviously, if we can make it cost the least amount of money possible, then the ROI calculation in theory should be better.
Right.
But what we find is the biggest thing that moves the needle for most brands is speed, right? When we can take and get a store open in, 3, 6, 12 months sooner than it would have otherwise gotten open, and then you compound that across 10 stores or 100 locations, that becomes really meaningful, right? That really, really moves the needle. And so that's the main thing that people talk about is how do we get the stores open? And we have a whole process for kind of how we go about that I can talk about. The other problem that we solve and is the location economics. So in franchising, they talk about location unit level economics, right? Because again, each location is its own individual business. And if each location doesn't have great unit level economics, right? If each location's not creating success, then there's no reason to open a bunch more of them,
Right.
right? That's the last thing we want to do is replicate failure. That's real bad. So that's the other part of the work that we do, which is how do we design these locations in a way that they can create success, which is really probably the stuff that is the most interesting. That's where the application of our balanced servicecape framework comes into play, where we're going in and we're developing, okay, how do we design a single unit, right? A single location, to balance that customer, employee, and owner experience is how we define it. And what are we going to do to be able to do that? Now, we're always, because we pretty much exclusively work with multi-location brands, we're always looking at that through the lens of our scale framework and how we're ultimately going to do that quickly and more cost controlled. But that's really where we're doing that. So it depends on where the brand is at. A great example of that And so a lot of the work that we've done over the years is, there's two different kind of groups of brands in that space. There's the emerging brand. There's that brand that's just getting up and running, that's just growing through that kind of first big pace of growth, so it's a new brand that's happening. And then there's what's called a re-emerging brand. And there's a lot of re-emerging brands out there. They're the ones that we've all written books about, read about in a lot of cases, right? So, there's a famous story of bringing back the Starbucks CEO after they did all of this explosive growth, and they had to shut down a bunch of stores and refocus everything. And then they got it all fixed, and then they were able to grow again, right? So there's these re-emerging brands that have had growth and had success at some point or another, but then something happened, and there you need to fix it, right? It's like, oh, whoops. And that's actually, so when we work with emerging brands, we work with those first time growth brands, it's our whole framework to be like, okay, we have all these case studies of what happens when brands scale without doing these things correctly, and it breaks the business model,
Right.
and then they crash, and then they have to reset, and they have to go again. Let's avoid that by fixing and paying attention to those. And so that's a lot of our frameworks is about how not to let a brand go through that.
Gotcha.
But a lot of our work is brands that have gone through that, and then they come back to us and they go, hey, we need to fix our location economics. We need to fix our customer, employee, and owner experience so that we can scale.
Right.
Yeah. So those are the two problems. So those are the two problems we solve, and kind of the different categories of the brands that come to us. The work to do is incredibly similar. The details, of course, are wildly different between each brand and between each specific situation, but ultimately the frameworks are the same.
Yeah.
And the outcome and the goal that you're trying to accomplish is the same. So
Yeah. Okay. Tate, you mentioned just in this last question about speed.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that the Katalyst methodology promises is speed and consistency. And I would wonder, like, what's the toughest lesson in designing something that is repeatable like that, but without making it feel like it's generic?
Well, we cheat. No.
Okay.
The reality is the clients that we serve are pretty much exclusively high touch service brands.
Okay.
So in that, when you step back and you think about that in the context that what the clients that we serve are selling is a co-created experience between customers and employees within a specific space, right?
Right.
So the reality is, because we're not serving products and product brands, we're serving these high touch, and we're not serving self-serve brands. They're high touch experiences. The reality is the people, right, is the thing that makes it not generic and makes it human, because they are, right? Which is why when we talk through our process and our framework with people, we talk about it in that format. It's the customer experience, the employee experience, and then the owner experience or the business case. And those three things have to remain in balance. It's probably one of the first problems we ever identified before we could articulate it even clearly was, and you talk about what was broken in the marketplace and what we couldn't find. Well, there was a whole bunch of people that wanted to talk about the customer experience. Everyone wants to talk about the customer experience. We want to do customer journey mapping, and we want to talk all about the customer experience.
Yeah.
But when you're in a high touch service business, the employee experience is every bit as important as the customer experience.
Yeah, you're talking my language.
Yeah. So that's a big piece of that puzzle, was understanding, okay, when we go through this process and we think about how to approach these different problems and how we're solving this, right? Like, we have to think about how that works. Now, we all agree that if there are no customers, then we don't need employees.
Yeah, right.
So we still start from the foundation of the customer journey and the customer experience that we want to create when we're doing service blueprinting or working through processes like that. But as we're making all the individual decisions, right, the thousands of decisions that have to get made through that design process, you're running all of those through that filter of, how does this affect the customer experience? How does this affect the employee experience? How does this affect the owner experience, the business case? And every decision has to be ran through that same filter. to understand how that is in order to keep it in balance.
Right.
Because
right.
there's a tension that exists between all three of those things.
Yeah.
And what happens is if you allow it to get lopsided, it's really hard to correct.
Yeah.
Right. So if you, right. And we all we've seen how many different examples do we have of somebody building this, a brand goes or a location gets built and it's this amazing thing and it wins all the design awards. It's beautiful, right? We put it in the magazines, we stood on stage and we said, thank you. I want to thank all the people that made this happen. And 2 years later, it's closed. It's out of business.
Uh-huh.
We have lots of examples of that. And which is always really sad to me. And that's a perfect example of what happens when, right, we get those things out of balance. Right. So there's another example of that, which is we are all really familiar with organizations and environments that prioritize the employee experience over everything else. Right? We call those public schools and DMVs. Right? Right? It's like,
good point.
But that's, it's like, we all have, some story of some government office that's this horrific experience and it's horrible. And if you were to put that through our framework, what would come out is, oh yeah, well, every time they made a decision, they chose the employee experience above all the other experiences. And that's the outcome of that is these horrific horrific customer experiences that in a free market world can only exist outside of that, right? Which is why they're always government offices, right? Because they're the ones that get to still have monopolies. And so that's where we get to with that type of stuff. But that's our framework and that lens. Now, obviously, in the early days, we didn't understand or have the language around being able to describe it that way, even though that is how we were making decisions. That's how we were doing design. That was the core of our design thinking from the beginning. We're just a lot better at talking about it today.
Yeah.
So
I imagine when you're thinking about the employee experience, and that resonates with us because we're focused on this intersection between employee experience and customer experience, and those two things are inextricably linked. I think when we think about the DMV as a great example of, it's the classic bad customer experience, but that's because counterintuitively the employee experience actually isn't tuned properly. And I would imagine that after a while, being an employee at the DMV doesn't feel good anymore either, even if things are more geared toward them. So I would imagine, part of what you're doing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but part of what you're doing is not just thinking about the physical plant, but thinking about the activity that takes place inside of it and how, what is the flow of customers and employees. So there's an element that perhaps you're designing for, efficient movement for employees as they're going through critical tasks, but also I would imagine that that there's an element of sort of making I don't know the best way to say this, but let's call it the right way of doing things, so almost built in to the physical space, right? So, there's the classic example. You can put, sidewalks on a campus and then watch where people actually walk. And they often don't coincide because we take this path of least resistance, right? So you can design the way that you want people to act. So I guess the question is, first of all, is that correct? What's the balance between all of that? And then if you're designing effectively how the employees behave, how do you keep that from being just cookie cutter from one, place to the next, keeping it human?
Let's be honest. There's a bunch of it that you want to be cookie cutter, right? You want,
right?
It's there's all the great cliches. Keep the main thing, and control the controllables. Like, and ultimately what you want is to make it where the things that truly matter, the things that truly make a big difference, well, those are the areas you want to focus on creating as much consistency as possible. And by making the things that need to be consistent in order to deliver a great customer experience or a great service, right? This is service delivery stuff. Like, we want those things to be as cookie cutter as possible. And we want the training and the space to allow the employee to do that as easily as possible. Because what that then creates is the opportunity for that customization, that unique experience, that human element, right? Because now they have the energy for that, they have the time for that, they have the space for that, because they're not wasting it trying to get all of the other stuff that has to get done consistently done. We've made that intuitive and easy, right? And and so to your point, that work, is all wrapped up into like environmental and behavioral psychology is actually where all that work is. And we've got lots of big fancy ways to talk about it and lots of big fancy words and all that kind of stuff. And what I think is so funny is most of the amazing examples we have, most of the best examples we have are the least sexy, dumbest, most down to earth, simple realities. And it's things like one of the early examples we used is we were working with an organization and they had an incredibly long transaction time. So, it's like, think about the customer and the employer interacting for what was like 45 minutes to go through all of this stuff. And during that process, the employee had to like walk away from the customer and come back a couple of times. During that process, there was a lot of paperwork that had to get printed, and the printer was behind the employee. So what you've got is several times during this transaction, you've got the employee having to turn their back to the customer in the middle of this conversation. So you're trying to create this human experience. It's already long. So obviously we worked really hard to say, well, why don't we make sure that each station has everything they need so they don't have to walk away and come back, right? Like, I understand operationally, it makes way more sense to store all the stuff in the exact same spot.
Right.
But from a customer experience and an employee experience standpoint, it actually makes a lot more sense to store a little bit in these 4 different spots so that they don't have to walk away all the time and come back, right? So that's the type of stuff, and that's the real world stuff that you get into that does that. One of the things we did for that brand specifically was we were able to push the workstations away from the wall, create a walkway behind it, put the printers there on the backside of that workstation, so that way, when they had to get up and they had to go to the printer and they had to get the stuff that they needed, they would get up, the printer was in front of them, and they were able to maintain the conversation with the customer during that entire transaction by simply just literally turning the cabinet from up against the wall to backed up against the desk and changing where the walkway was between them. It's sometimes like, that's the part that's so interesting sometimes, is the solutions to so many of these problems are so straightforward and right. Like it always cracks me up because so often the solutions are just not fancy. Right. And but those are the solutions that really make a huge difference in how everybody experiences what's going on there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think, when you're talking about that example in particular, what I'm struck with is that it's all about the lens that you're looking at the problem from, right? So if you're looking at the problem from the lens of, the operations or the financial side of things, having one place to put everything probably on paper, 1 is less than 4. It takes less time to stock all of these things. If we can, take a printer, right? It spends most of its time not printing. So obviously, from an economic perspective, if it's spending 1/10 of its time printing, we could have 4 employees use the same printer quite easily without ever tripping over each other. But as soon as you turn the lens around and look at the employee-customer interaction, then this result that you came up with becomes blindingly obvious. It's just not obvious if you're looking at it from this other lens. So it's often about the perspective, where you're standing, I guess, when you look at the problem, that makes something obvious or not.
Yeah, and yes, the answer is you nailed it. You got it exactly. And so when we talk about our balanced servicescape framework, what we're practically explaining is every one of those decisions has to be put through all 3 lenses. right?
Yeah.
So that's the whole point, is the challenge becomes and how it goes horribly wrong. So you ask the question, like, what mistakes do most people make?
Yeah.
Well, the simplest version of that answer is they let somebody that only has one perspective and one lens make a bunch of decisions.
Mhm.
That's the mistake they make, right? Is they take one perspective, one lens, and they let that person win, um, and that person, that perspective win,
Right.
and that's what ends up happening, right? So it's understanding, because it may be that in that case, okay, well, economically speaking, it breaks the business model to put 4 printers in there because that doesn't make any sense, and we need to have one, and there's IT requirements, and there's all these other kind of things, and it's like, okay, well, that's fine, but if we make that decision and we decide that we are gonna make the employee walk away from the customer 3 or 4 times, right, or once even, then what are the decisions we have to make to offset and rebalance those experiences and bring those back around? Like, how are we gonna then offset that? So it's all about making those decisions in context with one another, to ultimately get to the right outcome. That's exactly it. And like I said, it's so often the incredibly simple, basic things that actually are the ones that make the biggest change, right? We do all these really big, fancy, that photograph well things,
Mm-hmm.
but it's rarely those that actually made the difference,
Right.
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
When you're kind of working with your clients and you're kind of discussing these kind of things, do you ever find that you're getting pushback, or I mean, or is everybody pretty open to sort of, this is, we're here listening, and yeah, we get it, we get what you're telling us. Do you find that there's a hard part or a hard sell that you have to do
no, every
as you
client's
navigate through?
every team member of every client's just super open. Nobody has any concerns. Nobody's protecting their, world. There's, everyone just wants to work together, and we hold hands and we sing Kumbaya, and it's wonderful.
Yeah,
Absolutely. That's
I'm
totally how
asking
it
for a
goes.
friend. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But hypothetically, I can imagine if you weren't in that situation, uh, yeah, the answer is yeah. Um, so much of what we do is navigating the tensions between those
Mhm.
things, right? Like, probably, I would say one of the hardest parts of all the work we do is getting the right people in the room to do the
Yeah.
work.
Yep.
Unquestionably, one of the hardest things is actually having the right people in the room to do the work. And then the next piece is having those people in the right mindset to be able to do that work, right?
Yeah.
So, that's probably the single biggest trick and piece of the puzzle, which gets into, so it's so funny, right? Because people are like, "Ah, you design and build stuff," and I'm like, "Yeah, it's like, yes, eventually, that is what
Yeah.
we get to, but before that, we do a lot of therapy,
Yeah.
right? So you're doing a lot of marriage counseling, and a lot of team building, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of trust building. So, and that's where they really, what you have to get to. When you have, so to your point, and I will say, when you have a great team that has that trusting foundation, right, where they're free to enter into healthy conflict, and when everybody understands what the greater good is
Yeah.
and what it is that we're trying to accomplish. I mean, when you do have those, and we do have those quite often, it is magical
Yeah.
to see that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. And everybody walks out of the meeting with these big aha moments, and you can see where people's paradigms have shifted, and they've seen perspectives from other people that they hadn't seen in the past. Those are, I mean, it's really gratifying when we get to have those conversations and those meetings. And in the franchise space, it's awesome because we're always able to frame it with this incredibly powerful North Star, which is,
Uh-huh.
hey, if the franchisees win, we all get a chance to win.
Yeah.
So we
Mhm.
always have this thing where it's like, hey, the whole goal that we're like what we're all doing here is ensuring that the franchisees can win. So we can all rally behind that goal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that really helps that situation. And then, especially because when we do a lot of this work, there's often franchisees in the room, right? They're part of
Mhm.
this.
Yeah.
Um, and, uh, and so that's always a really, really powerful thing. It also creates a really easy filter
Mm.
for when we end up in situations where people are trying to make decisions or pushing on things or whatnot, where we're able to be like, can you see how the way you're talking, the way you're operating, the way you're thinking, or what you're doing, isn't in service to them
Right.
and isn't going to create the results that you want to create. Um, and so you have to have and be able to navigate those conversations. Which fundamentally goes back to why we don't work with publicly traded companies, right? Because it's a conflict, right? We tried to do it some, and we just discovered it doesn't work, right?
Right.
Because it's like you're asking a team to serve two masters, right? It's like, okay, well, you have to serve your shareholder and you have to serve the franchisees. And the answer is, well, those two things are at odds with one another. Like, and so it just becomes too hard, right?
Right.
And so that's the reason why I'm sure, and there's a lot of there's a lot of fantastic franchise networks that do happen to be publicly traded, and they navigate that and they balance that to the best of their ability, um, and and good luck to them. I like what we do is hard enough. That's just like one, like,
Mhm.
I'm like, just one extra layer where I'm like, that's too much.
Yeah.
So
So, we've been talking about this, call it the service design side of it, right? The inside that ideal location, but now you need to replicate that experience across many, many locations. Where do you see most brands stumbling when they get to that scale portion of it?
almost always they want to put the cart ahead of the horse, right?
Mm.
That's always the thing, right? So, um, and this one was a lot harder. The balanced servicescape framework and our understanding of how to design those spaces and get to that, I'd say that's a framework, that's understanding, that's work that we kind of discovered and codified and really understood a long time ago and have been
Mhm.
working with that for a really, really long time. Um, the what we refer to as our quick brick system, uh, pending a better name. If we only had a good marketing agency,
I
uh,
can
the
introduce you.
the but that was a discovery process, right? And so I will tell you, it's been several years ago now. Um, I remember we had been kind of tracking like how many locations we had opened up for all these different brands, and we crossed the 2,000 mark.
Hmm.
So we had opened 2,000 locations across the country for various different brands, and um, and I took 6 months probably where I literally stepped back and said, "Ah, it feels like we're reinventing the wheel every time, right? It feels like everything has to be like these giant like custom, like we're treating each program development like it's this big custom project, and w- we've done this enough times now. Like, let's consolidate all of the learning. Let's consolidate all the best practices. Let's bring all that together. And so I started that process, and we started bringing all these things together and starting really asking, okay, well, what have we seen when it's gone the best? What did it not? What didn't work? Like, what are all of those things? And so we started putting that together. Today, it's been developed into this quick brick system that we talk about, and we now have it identified, right? Like fundamentally, we talk about there's the foundations, right? So we've got the bricks that have to be in place to build the foundation,
Mhm.
and once you've built that foundation, what we accomplish is chaos reduction, right? You've got to build this foundation
Mm.
just to get rid of the chaos,
Yeah.
right? Like it's madness until you can get these basic things in place. The next level up is where we start putting cost control in place. Now everybody wants cost savings, and you have to explain to them, it's like, well, we don't get cost savings until we get cost control,
Mm. Mhm.
right? We
Mm.
have to be able to estimate accurately and then actually meet the estimate. Once we can do that, then we can start talking about how we reduce costs in any meaningful way. But the reality is what people really want is that next level, which is okay, now how do we do it faster? How
Mhm.
do we do speed? And we talk a lot about the problem is, of course, everybody comes wanting speed, right? It's like that's what they want, right? It's like how do we get locations open way faster? And the answer is, well, you start with eliminating the chaos and putting these things in place, and we can show you the tools and the systems and the things that have to be in place.
Mhm.
And then once we have those in place, we can then work on, okay, now here's the things that have to be in place so that we can control costs appropriately. And then once we have that in place, we get to doing these things up here that are the things that really move the needle on making it happen a lot faster.
Yeah.
And so when you ask about what do people do and what is the challenge, well, they always want the thing that they want, but without doing the things that have to be done in order to build on that foundation. And the easiest way to explain that is, right, like the you have to be effective before you get to be efficient.
Mm.
You have to do the right things in the right order before figuring out how to do them fast is a good idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if you're doing the wrong things in the wrong order really quickly,
You're just failing faster.
Yeah, it's replicating. Yeah. Right.
it's just like now there's a fail fast. There's an iteration piece to that. There's definitely we want to learn fast. We want to close the loop, and we want to get those learnings. We want to integrate those in, and we want to do those things. But we're talking about the highest level, right? You're talking about, hey man, if you're doing the wrong things in the wrong order, that's real bad.
Right.
And at pace, the faster you go, the worse it gets.
Mhm.
And so that's what we want to eliminate is those things. And so, and that's how we came up with those things, right? I would love to tell you that we're just real smart, and I have some of the smartest team members I've ever met. I pinch myself every day that, like, I still don't understand. We just have some amazing people, some incredibly smart, incredibly talented individuals that are part of our team.
Yeah.
And so often I'm just gracious and grateful that they like are helping our clients and going on this journey and excited about it.
Yeah.
But even with all of that, figuring out everything I just told you, it was a big discovery process
Yeah.
where it was, okay, how do we take everything we've learned on all of this stuff and put it together? And so that's how we ended up developing that.
Yeah.
And now we can implement it. And now, of course, we're continually refining and making those templates better and getting better at understanding how we more effectively put all those things in process. And we're getting the discovery process more refined. And so it's going to be, it's a continuous evolution of
Mhm.
how easy we make getting all those things put together.
Yeah.
But of course, every brand is a little bit different. A restaurant that has a kitchen is just a fundamentally different, it just has different parameters and different problems to solve than, an electronics repair store.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
much simpler, right? Like that's just the reality. So
I you know, I feel really lucky because you just mentioned about the talented people that you work with, and I feel very fortunate that I'm working with a great team of talented, architects, interior designers, land planners. Um, and in the arena that we're working in, so this question is not gonna be self-serving. The arena that we're working in, we work in senior housing, multifamily housing, student housing, a lot of those kind of places, and we're shaping walls, layouts, we're creating communities, but we also know that we're creating, shared experiences, where people are living, where they're dining, how they're interacting, what they're, maybe even how they're co-working, wayfinding, like so many things are experiences that we're shaping. And we think about those as architects and designers. I'm curious though, as you talk about your work and the body of things that you've kind of come across and how you do things, I'm wondering how could an architectural or design firm borrow something from the service industry side, to improve our work?
yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Um, I started this by saying it's hard because so much of the way we go about doing things is just inherent, right? When we have the advantage of working with multi-location brands, which means we have the ability to do the research to see how it's working in another similar space,
Mm.
Right.
right? So that observation, that research, that we use to understand how people are acting, right? Like, yes, we have some amazing people with amazing knowledge about behavioral psychology and environmental psychology and all of those things that we use as best we possibly can to predict how people are going to act and respond. But the reality is, a lot of what we're doing is observation and research and seeing how people respond and then understanding how we deal with that or what the problems are there. Very similar to your sidewalk conversation earlier, right? Where it's just like
Right.
you can put a bunch of sidewalks in, or you can see where people walk and then pave them, right? So kind of similar to that. So I would say our frameworks and the way we go a lot about this fit into that, see where people walk and then pave the paths. And that's an advantage that we have dealing with multi-location. But in the work that you guys are doing, I have to assume that there's enough similarities, right? Like if you've
Yeah.
built a dorm for college students or you've built senior housing, right, for 55 plus or whatnot, there is the ability for you to take those learnings and document those and an understanding, right? So it goes back to
Yeah.
research, right? We do a
Mhm.
lot of interviews, we do a lot of interviewing, we do a lot of market research that involves like talking to the customers, talking to the employees,
Yeah.
talking to the operators to understand their perspective on things, and then being able to document that. Um, so I'd say that's probably a big piece of that puzzle. So I would say if we're approaching that, that would be the first step, right?
Yeah.
As designers, we all have a tendency to think that we're smart,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's always great to listen to the user, right, and be like,
Yeah.
oh, right, that's
Well, and it's really easy, especially in the design side of things, to get caught up in the aesthetics of something.
yes,
And get really kind of, you'll go into, to all ends of the earth to make sure that you've done that. But then, yeah, you could miss out on something else, some other piece of experience that we just have totally missed because we were so focused on the aesthetics of something.
it
Yeah.
is a common conversation in our world where we are dealing with the typical process that brands go through is they work with an architect to develop what they refer to as the prototype,
Mhm.
which is kind of the template set of architecturals. And the number of conversations I've had over 20 years that involved some well-meaning young architect basically saying, "Well, we copy and pasted the finish schedule. What more do you need?" Right?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
and that's I'm like, "You've missed the forest for the trees." The things that need to be replicated. Um, so we do a lot of architects, right? So we do a lot of adjacency diagrams. We do
Mhm.
a lot of like flow diagrams and understanding traffic patterns, customer like wait times, that type of stuff. You do a lot of we have a calculation that we talk about for a long time, which we refer to as the butt to butt measurement, right?
Okay.
So because there's this whole conversation around, how much personal space
Mm.
is appropriate and what people want, right? Like what will they walk past? Um,
Mhm.
it's those little things like that. Like for instance, some of the and this is a lot of stuff that we've learned over all these years, mostly through observation. But one of those that's a great example is, in a fast casual restaurant where there's a queue line that's going to go up to the order window, right?
Mhm.
And in a lot of cases, that queue line is going to pass people that are dining and sitting down and eating that have already gotten their food. Well, there's nothing more awkward than sitting at a seated height table next to a queue line so that you're sitting with your face in somebody's rear end as
Mm.
they're, going to get food.
Yep.
So knowing that that's true, how do we use that to design around it? And the answer is, well, we're going to put a stem wall in place. We're going to put a room divider. We're going to put bar height tables instead of seated height along the queue, right? Like there's a handful of different ways we can solve that problem, but
Yeah.
it's understanding that we're not going to allow somebody to be at a seated height table next to the queue line. And that's the type of standard that we document
Mm.
and replicate as we replicate those spaces. Y
Yeah.
Whether or not
Yeah.
the table is the same table, and whether or not the chair is the same chair may matter, and whether or not we use the same flooring and the same paint and all that kinda stuff, those are things that operationally, this gets into the owner experience. The facilities team loves it when we make all the stuff the same. They
Mhm.
love consistency, and there's value in doing that. But that's not the thing that actually creates the successful outcome for the employee owner and experience, right? So
Right.
that's a piece of the owner experience fundamentally, but that's not really what it is. So it's how do we document those things to say, okay, here's the rules, right? The we always want them to go left, and we want them to go past this, and we want them, and we make sure that we never have seated height along the queue. And it's documenting those rules for how we're going to design those spaces. That's the actual standards that we put in place so that we have those. Now, if it's a brand that that's doing ground up builds, like if we're doing a pad, if we're doing a standalone building and a ground up build the whole time, then cool. Then there's a lot of times where you can get to a prototype set of architecturals because at the end of the day, the only thing that customizes is the site plan,
Right.
right? Like, because we're gonna drop the same building every time on top of the site plan. And that gets into modular and prefab construction methodologies, which has pretty much become the standard now for any fast food, fast casual, standalone construction in the space. You're seeing that now, right? Like the Seven Brews are a great example where they come in on a trailer and drop in place. Wendy's comes in on like 2 or 3 trailers and they put together. So that prefab and modular has become the standard for standalone, because it can be the same every time.
Yeah.
The overwhelming majority of these spaces that are getting built are going into tenant finish projects and into existing real estate, right? So where you have to apply all of those standards to each space.
Right.
And so I think that, to come all the way back to your question, it totally makes sense to me that those type of standards are things that could be identified and developed and documented in the multifamily work or in the other type of housing stuff, where we're just like, hey, what we've learned is that when we put the community space on each floor between the rooms, and this is what happens, we learned that. So it's documenting those standards and those best practices based on how we've actually seen people use it and interact and all that kind of stuff. Because there's nothing worse than a designer that's convinced that people are going to behave a certain way only to find out that that's not at all
what they're doing.
Right.
how people are going to, right? Like nobody's going to walk all the way down and then hang a right and take the sidewalk up. They're going to cut across at a diagonal because obviously they are. Those are the things, right? So
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Right.
Yeah. Tate, I could talk to you for another hour, but in the interest of not going too long on this visit, maybe we can kind of conclude with this. Our audience, a lot of them are marketers, or they're running a service organization of some kind, professional service organization. So what advice would you give them, or what would you want them to take away from this conversation that might help them build a more human brand experience for themselves?
I think one of the biggest things is get out and have experiences, right? Like the best teacher is doing it, right? So we talk a lot about, I have a big poster in my office that says, vision without execution is hallucination, right? So I think we have an epidemic where people think that coming up with the ideal answer to the problem or the right answer to the problem, it has value. And those of us that have been around the real world for a long time understand that it turns out that there's actually not a lot of value in understanding what the ideal answer to a problem is. The world rewards us, right, in all the different ways for being really good at understanding how close we can get to the ideal answer with the available time, money, and resources. Right? So it's about, that's where all of the stuff is. And I would say, as I talk to especially marketers and especially designers that are younger in their careers, that's probably one of the biggest things that I would say is, when you come to the understanding that real value isn't in knowing what the right or ideal answer is, but it's in understanding how we get to that, as close to that as possible within real constraints. That to me is a thing. Like if people can flex that muscle and wrap their brain around that, I think that's one of the biggest things that makes a huge, huge, huge difference, right? There's nothing worse for us than having a client come to us with these beautiful renderings that they just love.
Yep.
They can't have them because the renderings have levitating unobtainium for countertops, and like those are beautiful renderings. They're way outside your budget and they're violating the laws of physics, but other than that, they're fantastic, right? Like that's so. And yeah, I'm making a tongue-in-cheek comment, but I think that's the way that I can say that, right? Like to me,
Yeah.
the beauty of design is something that is as simple as it can possibly be and no simpler. Constraints are what makes design beautiful. If it wasn't for the constraints, then it wouldn't be fun.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the embrace that, right? Embrace that as good design is how do we get as close as possible within these constraints. But it requires kind of recalculating or recalibrating how you approach the problem and how you see the problem, and ultimately how you get satisfaction from solving.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it, especially when we're talking to folks that are in a creative space, like, designers on a branding team, or architects or engineers, the most elegant solution, the best possible, the taking things, because you can always make it incrementally better, but there becomes a point where that is diminishing returns.
It falls off. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Our chief strategy officer, we keep talking about, she's going to write a book someday about excess perfection syndrome. And it's all the behavioral and psychological parts of the challenges with excess perfection syndrome. And I can't wait to read that book when she writes it someday. And I'm going to keep saying it publicly until she does, because she has it inside of her. And I think that the world needs to hear all the things that she has learned and thinks about that topic. But it's an excellent thing that, and when we see people embrace it and we see people understand it, like it makes it makes a much bigger impact than people understand.
Yeah. I like how you say that excess perfectionism, because oftentimes, it's easy to say, oh, that's good enough. And for good designers, no matter the discipline, the words good enough is like you swore at them, right? It's like you said a string of bad words in church but excess perfectionism is, I really love that.
Well, it's getting it to excellent, not perfect.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the deal. And the part that people miss on the good enough part is the enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not mediocre and lousy.
Right.
It's good enough, right? Like
right.
it's actually accomplishing what we set out to accomplish. It's making a meaningful change in whatever it is that we're trying to affect or change, right? Like it's good enough, right? Like it accomplished a significant thing. And to your point, and from here on out, it's a diminishing return.
Right.
And understanding that getting to that point is the thing that actually creates the wins.
Yeah.
And that is exactly it. So sorry, that was a really long-winded answer to your question, I feel like. But
for all the constituents, I love how you bring both the customer and the employee into it, but also the owner into it. It is a trifecta that has to be balanced well in order for it to work.
I'm a big fan of my three-legged stool analogies. I have a lot of three-legged stool analogies in all of my trainings and in all of my talks.
Yeah.
So
great.
Well, Tate, it has been amazing to have you on. We're definitely going to do this again because there's a whole bunch more questions that I have. But I think we have taken enough of your time for this edition. Carl, why don't you ask him your favorite question to close things out?
This is my favorite question. It's where you get to educate me and everybody else. Tate, again, thank you also for sharing all you've done today too. I'm like Jerry. Let's keep the conversation going. But before we leave, the question we do want to ask is there a book or a podcast right now that you'd recommend that our audience be tuning into or looking for on the local bookshelf?
I would say probably um, the thing that is become like I binge listened to it and it's become somewhat of a problem. Is there's a podcast called Founders,
Okay.
and which is kind of, yeah, probably not. And it is a gentleman that has set out to read biographies of specifically famous industry titans and business owners and entrepreneurs and other historical figures. And he reads the biography and then he talks about in the podcast, he walks you through his thoughts and insights for that biography and talks about how it ties together and whatnot. And
Hmm.
it is just amazing,
Okay.
right? It's the old saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I find so much value and so much insight um, out of listening to the stories of, people that did great things and big things, up to and including there's a lot to learn about what not to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the podcast Founders is, to me, probably, I can't recommend that enough to people. It's a wonderful, and the
Right.
guy Daniel that does it is amazing. So
That's
Perfect.
fantastic. So
Perfect.
where can our listeners find more information about you, about Katalyst?
so catalystgroupinc.com is our web address. I'm not really active on any social media outside of LinkedIn. So if you want to reach out to me, right? So Tate Fisher on LinkedIn. I'm not a female health coach. So that's not who I am. And there's not a lot of Tate Fishers running around the internet. So that comes in handy. But and I'm not the one with the long dark brunette hair that I tend to get a lot of questions about. So
Well,
there you go.
we'll put the
Yeah.
actual link in the show notes and the link back to Katalyst. Tate, thank you again for being a part of the show. And I think that that wraps up another episode of the Intangible Brand. As always, if you found some value in today's conversation, and I know we did, please take a moment to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Your support really does help us continue to bring these kinds of discussions forward to folks like you.
And if you've happened to be watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. It's another way in which we can help others discover the show and join our community.
And of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Feel free to leave us a review or share your feedback or questions with us. You can reach us at hello@theintangible.brand.com by email. Tell us what you liked or what you'd like to hear next.
And you can always connect with us on LinkedIn or visit the website, theintangible.brand.com. There you'll find some more resources and information about the show.
So thank you for joining us on The Intangible Brand. Remember, the strongest brands are built on the experiences they create, both for their clients and their teams, and as we heard today, the owners as well. Thank you so much.